If late at night, when watching the moon, you still sometimes get vertigo, it's understandable that you wish suddenly and hard for fences, for someone to marry you. Desiring a working knowledge, needing to know some context by heart, you might accept anything, the room without windows, the far and frozen north, or the prairie even, if it means that. The long, wide space and the cold dirt that will not be seduced into hills, and the dust that even after you have kicked and wept and fallen on it pounding will not produce a tree. It will allow you to rise with certainty and move with the relief of necessary things to the wash on the line, to the small maple you brought here that must be tied for the winter or die. Even the prairie night, blind with snow, when no one comes and you no longer look to the mirror but force your fingers to the stitching and produce a child to help with the lambing and the carrying of water, although it might be years before you tum and stop, startled by the sweet and sudden smell of sheets snapping in the sun and the drunken lilac, prairie purple, blooming by the doorway because you planted it.
Marie Howe opens the poem with visual imagery to establish this lonely nighttime scene, inviting the reader to engage in the setting's instinctively reflective nature. The moon symbol introduces the first mention of a motif of consistent cycles that, true to its name, reappears throughout the duration of the poem to signify the different stages of the speaker's life. Moons specifically wax and wane. The lonely tone of the poem indicates that the speaker is currently experiencing a waning or low chapter of their life. As the scene unfolds, the speaker notes that if you still sometimes get vertigo, it's understandable that you wish suddenly and hard for fences, for someone to marry you. In this way, it's clear that the speaker is experiencing a lack of stability and identity in their life. This anxiety is presented through synesthesia as a tangible feeling of vertigo. A mental spiral out of control is translated into a physical sensation of whirling and loss of balance, something that you might feel on a roller coaster packed with harrowing twists and turns. It's only logical that one would long for the safety and comforting entrapment of a fence or the automatic identity label of marriage. The connection between fences and marriage is insinuated by Ace and Denton between the two concepts, for fences, for someone to marry, both existing as a gatekeeper of pure freedom, of which Howe classifies as dangerous to someone without any direction in their life. This reiterates the additional motif of identity. A lack of structure and guidance leads to the search for something, anything concrete to latch onto. Desperation follows as a result. The poem then adopts this fervent, desperate tone, and this desire to know some context by heart, you might accept anything. Following this statement is a parenthetical in the form of a colon, allowing pause for personal reflection of what one might accept for themselves, and providing additional examples of what one might be so hasty to accept. A room without windows, or the far and frozen north, depicts utter isolation, yet the objective safety of a trapped situation. Howe connects this back to the undoubted stability and label, yet prison of marriage. The final example is given through repetition in Ace and Denton, or the prairie even, if it means that. The word prairie is repeated to establish the lengths one would have to go through to find themselves seeking a prairie which, although it symbolizes the desire for progress, is depicted as something scary and unknown at this point in the poem. Growth and development is, quite honestly, never easy, and Howe makes sure to address this in the following stanzas.
Marie Howe carries on the poem in the second stanza by establishing a further sense of loneliness and isolation. Howe uses visual imagery through descriptions of vast wide spaces and cold dirt. Both of these descriptors convey a tone of solitude that seems to characterize the entire poem. In line 10, Howe states that these wide spaces and cold dirt will not be seduced into hills. The word seduced in this context of a desolate prairie creates a strong illusion between the situation being presented in the poem and a biblical story from the book of Matthew. In this story, Jesus is led into the desert to be tempted by the devil, to which he resists. Much like Jesus in the story, the vast plains and prairies will resist temptation to grow into hills. Rather, they stay flat and boundless as a test of character and personal growth. Howe further goes on to describe the anguish and agony faced through these trials of personal development. In line 11, Howe writes that even after you have kicked and wept and fallen on the desolate sand of the prairie, you still will not produce a tree. In other words, though someone has worried, anguished over, and tried any means possible, they still will not revive what they desire if the environment does not permit. It is here that we also see Howe's first implementation of the growing tree motif, a motif that, along with the poem, symbolizes the cycle of life and the idea of personal growth and maturity. Halfway through the stanza, Howe mediates this defeating tone by providing reason for the despair previously described. This highlights the first shift in the poem from a tone of distress to a tone of assuredness and optimism. Howe states that the previous trials mentioned earlier in the poem will allow you to rise with certainty and move with relief, clearly conveying the idea that maturity and wisdom come from these trials and tribulations that everyone faces. Howe points out the necessity of things to be washed and placed on the line. The reference to the chore of laundry highlights the idea that one must get the everyday means of their life in order to continue on this path of personal growth. In the last line of the stanza, Howe brings back the symbol of life and growth in the form of a maple tree, which emphasizes another point Howe wishes to convey, that point being the need for consistency in the process of development, which she displays through another use of the motif of the cold and winter to represent stagnation and loneliness. Howe, in the end, drives the point that without consistency, things in one life, including a small maple tree, will not prosper.
When looking at this section, we again see the mention of the prairie night, except this time with the change being in that it is covered in snow, meaning a new beginning, adding on to the motif of a cycle which has been present throughout the poem. Following this is the mention of a mirror, signifying a type of truth. This same mirror is describing a form of self-reflection, quite literally. The tone throughout this section is a melancholy one, with the mention of lambing and the next line signifying innocence, which ties into the overall meaning denoted by the title Keeping Still. The last line featuring carrying of water means to assist someone, presumably towards the lambing that is mentioned in the previous line. The motif of identity is also present in the segment of the poem, and that the word you is mentioned on the second line and the word your on the third.
In the last few lines, the poem experiences the same developments that are discussed previously, and the theme of personal growth continues to be explored. Howe speaks of how it is never too late to take a look back at all of your accomplishments and achievements in life, and emphasizes the value of self-reflection and introspection. These acts are not selfish, but rather essential to one's internal and mental growth. If we spend our whole lives without doing this, we could be missing out on important life lessons. The poem comes to a close with the transition word although, signifying a rapid or abrupt halt in the poem and in life in general. Additionally, words like tum, stop, and halt are examples of a change in meter in the poem. It is also important to note the shift to depictions of spring and color as opposed to the desolate, cold, and lonesome motifs and symbols seen in the rest of the poem. For example, the sheet snapping in the sun and the purple lilac are visual representations which juxtapose the instances previously mentioned, such as the cold dirt or the act of weeping. The expression, April showers bring May flowers, is a good analogy because of realistic representations of hardships we all face in life, as well as the highlights. The poem encompasses the ups and downs and suggests that we should all grow from our mistakes and that there are cycles, just as we find in nature. Lastly, the poem ends with the phrase, because you planted it, a final reminder that one's developments are caused by one's own initiatives. More than a cautionary literary work, Keeping Still is a catalyst for change.